So let's dig into this with Mark Hanna. We just heard the characterization here of that meeting between Putin and Prigozhin. Civil, no reprimand, despite what looked like was going to be a strong reaction here. What do you make of that?
Right. Well, I think that we have to think about the theatrics here, and Russia is very determined at a moment when NATO is, they're portraying NATO as somewhat fractured and fragmented in their propaganda, that they want to project unity at all costs, right? So this was a sudden about-face for Putin to start calling Prigozhin he didn't refer to him as a friend, but having kind of a unified message about defending the motherland, and then they can say, look, you know what? And Russian propaganda had a field day with this. Those cluster munitions that are being provided by the United States, just months ago, their spokesperson was saying this was a war crime. And so now the United States is, Russian propaganda has really made hay of that. And they're, if they want nothing more than NATO to be fragmented, and Biden and the Western leaders that are meeting in Lithuania right now and the NATO alliance want nothing more than to project unity, each side is projecting the other as fragmented and fractured while projecting themselves as unified. And so we need to take this kind of reporting with, look at it through that lens for sure.
Okay, so let's talk about those cluster munitions. Proponents say this could be a game changer here in Ukraine being able to defend itself. Ukraine doesn't want to use it on Russian turf. They just want to use it on their own soil to get the Russians out. But critics say that this type of munition produces a lot of duds. So essentially an innocent civilian could, find it, but God forbid, play with it and it goes off. So that's why a lot of people don't want it to be used. But here we have the President Biden saying, look, they're running out of other ammunition. This is what we have to do right now. You're looking at video here of those cluster munitions going off. Was this the right call? And also, how does this impact our relationship with other allies who are against this?
Yeah, I think we see the moral ground. I agree with the New York Times editorial board that critiqued the flawed moral logic of cluster munitions. You're right. They have a high degree of a high dud rate, right? Up to 40%. And this is like armor-piercing, soldier-killing bomblets that come out of this and cast a wide net. So, President Biden has said, well, they're not being used in civilian zones. They're only being used in conflict zones. Well, when the war is over, it's all civilian zones. And I was in Vietnam not too long ago, and we saw the legacy of unexploded ordnance over in Vietnam. I think that there is a real, to some extent, I don't want to ever agree on MSNBC with Russian propaganda, but their propaganda has a point. The United States is talking out both sides of its mouth, and there's a reason most countries on Earth ban these weapons. They're really deadly and they're dangerous to civilians.
So let's talk about what some of these countries are going to be talking about here at the NATO summit. It doesn't look like Ukraine is going to become a member nation anytime soon, but yet we have Erdogan of Turkey saying, I'll let this happen, rather for Sweden, if we can join the European Union. So how big of a step is that in terms of Sweden joining? And then what are the steps eventually for Ukraine joining?
Sure. It's pretty remarkable the amount of horse trading that's going on. And this is important because it's an alliance that's built on consensus and it's baked into the charter of the UN. So every member country has to agree for something like this. The president is right that Ukraine is not yet ready for membership in NATO, aside from, the basic fact that it currently doesn't control its territory, which is a requirement. There's a way in which it decreases the security of all the countries there. I was at the NATO Defense College in Rome, Italy, about 2 or 3 months into the war. And it's interesting because Putin wants to portray this war as a proxy war against NATO. NATO has no formal role, but NATO member countries are supporting Ukraine very generously and training soldiers and that kind of thing. That's the appropriate response from NATO member countries right now. People talk about, well, we created a treaty with Germany, we created one with South Korea, we should do the same with Ukraine. Ukraine doesn't match those countries in terms of its geopolitical importance to the United States. We didn't fight a war like we did in Korea or with World War II. It's more like Israel, right? An important but imperfect democracy that we need to support through security assistance, but that ultimately, if we had to, send in American troops every time Hamas launched a rocket into Israel, it's in a very fraught zone. And these alliances, they're not meant to simply promote democracy. These are real things. And Joe Biden is right. We need to defend every inch of territory that we have committed to doing. If we sort of let Ukraine in because it feels good and we want to defend Ukraine, we have to, as Joe Biden said, we are essentially at war with Russia. And so nobody wants that, especially Americans. They're the ones who, there's no desire among Americans to go to war with Russia over Ukraine, and Americans are the ones that Joe Biden has taken an oath to defend.
Now we're looking at some images right now of the president last hour touching down in Lithuania. Mark Hanna, thank you so much for the conversation. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Lindsay.
And in our next hour,